Hey, and welcome to the Well Bible Reading Journey podcast. We are in week 68. We're still in Judges. We're in Judges 16, 17, 18. We're going to be in Psalm 68 this week, and we're going to start the Gospel of John. We're going to be in John 1 this week, which I'm really looking forward to starting another Gospel together.
I am too, and John is probably my favorite Gospel.
All right.
The synoptic Gospels that we've reviewed are amazing, but John is just speaking to me in ways that I think are just different and unique. So I can't wait to dive into it.
Yeah, he wrote it to be unique and different. And so we can't wait to talk about it together.
Outstanding.
Yeah. But let's start in Judges.
Yep.
Awesome.
Got a lot of ground to cover in Judges.
We sure do. In Judges, we're actually finishing up the Samson story.
We are.
We talked a lot about that last week. We're going to finish that. And then we have a few other chapters about these Levites and other
and
family.
idols and more ephods and what's the tribe of Dan doing.
Yeah, there's a lot going on here.
Yeah. I mean, I want to kind of sum up in the front here about kind of where this is taking us, because I was kind of pleased with myself on the wordplay I was able to pull out. And this will be in our summary, but we're going to find 1,100 pieces of silver that Delilah gets today starts to influence Israelite history in ways that are becoming, or they are turning Israel into the anti-story. Mm-hmm. And so I wrote, we follow the impact of 1,100 pieces of silver and see how it destroys Israel. Once commanded to devote their enemies to God's judgment, herem, the word herem that we talked about in Joshua, Israel has now devoted itself to God's judgment. So they're in the place that God had meant them go into the promised land and devote their enemies to God's judgment. But now they're in that seat of God's enemies. Yeah. And so what does that mean? What does that say about them?
Yeah, that's exactly right. We talked about herem and him wanting to utterly destroy the evil in the land. And here Israel is the one being evil in the land and doing the very things he's asked him not to do. And so herem is going to have to come upon his people, at least in some sense.
Yes.
They cannot be utterly devoted to God. They're so unholy in these stories.
And we'll see destruction start to come upon them. We've already seen it come upon Shechem, the city of Shechem, and upon, which was the heart of Israel. And we've seen it come upon the tribe of Ephraim.
That's right, we will. So as we enter into the last story of the Samson story in chapter 16, I noticed that when we first start, you see Samson went down into Gaza. Here we go. It seems like he hasn't learned his lesson.
Still going down.
He's still going down. Not only is he going down geographically, but I think he's going spiritually.
Oh, yeah,
I think it's for sure just a little play on words. He's going down spiritually as well. And he keeps going to these Philistine cities. Like he can't stay out of them.
Yeah.
It's like I see so much lust in Samson. He lusts out of his frustration. He lusts out of his desires. He lusts out of his eyes for the women. There's so much lust happening in Samson. It's like he can't help himself but to go into the city.
We talked last week about how in tradition we like to think of how his strength comes from his hair. And there's some biblical warrant for that. I'm not arguing against that because it's there. But the underlying message is that his real weakness is his eyes.
That's right.
And we talk about in Judges, people did what was right in their own eyes, and Samson embodies that literal truth about Israel.
And at the end of this story, just to fast forward, he will lose his eyesight.
Yes,
which I think is fascinating. When I read that, based on what you said last week, I was like, that's interesting.
It is interesting.
Yeah. And then after that is when he sort of kind of does his one last final thing for Yahweh, it seems like, for the first time. He finally he's still doing it selfishly.
That's kind of where I was at. It was, he has the prayer at the end of 16, Lord, help me take vengeance for my eyes.
For myself. Yeah. And you're like, that's still a little selfish.
You're calling upon Yahweh finally, but it's for a very self-righteous and self-redeeming.
Yeah,
right?
He's half there.
Yeah.
Half there.
Very, very arrogant still. Very egotistic.
For sure. But God uses him anyways, and he accomplishes his purpose.
He keeps going to the Philistines because we read in, I think, chapter 14, in his call, God's called his parents that he would begin to deliver Israel from the Philistines. And so I think he's drawn to the Philistines.
Yeah.
He's obviously drawn sinfully to the women, but God wants him to go to the Philistines to deliver Israel, and so he gets diverted.
He does. I think it's exactly right. I think you're right on point. And then he gets there, and he has his eyes for this woman.
Yeah.
And not yet. This is the prostitute
you're
first.
Right.
The prostitute first, and he sleeps with her. And then while he's with her, they find out that Samson's in town. So they try to have an ambush, and they get an ambush ready for him because surely he won't leave middle of the night, right? Because he's with this woman. So he's going to stay all night. So we're going to have this ambush ready. We'll be sleeping. We'll be ready for him when he wakes up in the morning. But Samson kind of gets a feel of what's happening. So what does he do? He gets up, and he goes out, and he takes the gates. Now, these are huge gates. Yeah. These are not little. These are huge gates.
These are like city gates.
Right? Yeah, city gates. And he takes them and places them on his back, and he takes them. I try to figure out how far away it was, but I had one person say it was over 13 miles away. Dang. Someone else I saw said 40 miles away. 13 and 40, it's a big difference. But
still, either way, superhuman strength.
Superhuman strength to take these gates, and he took them up on a hill, and he uses this weird word called, in the Hebrew, it was said he unhinged the gates. This word unhinged actually is a word in Hebrew that means someone who is unhinged mentally. And I thought it was fascinating that he's unhinging them physically, but it's used almost someone madness. It's a word for someone gone mad. It's almost like he unhinged the gates because he's gone mad.
Because he's unhinged.
Yeah, he's unhinged himself, which I thought was really interesting.
Wow.
And he takes them out. But why did he take the gates? I asked myself that question. Did you think about that, Greg? Like, why the gates specifically? What do the gates mean to the city? They must mean something.
Entry into the city.
Okay, yeah.
It means we're open to the outsiders coming in.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think that's one of the reasons. I found two reasons why I think maybe he took the gates. Two reasons specifically. Gates in that culture stood for two things. One, during times of peace, the gates were the place where the judges sat and ruled over the cases, and that so the gates were a place of sign of authority in times of peace. In times of war and bad times, it was the weakest point of the city. Because if the gates could not be sealed, that was the weakest point of the city. So you're only as strong as your gates.
Interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
And so if you think about it, in that time, gates meant authority and meant strength. And so he literally is almost like taking their authority and taking their strength and taking it across and putting it somewhere else.
That's a really interesting find. And he literally implements what he wanted to do. And in the end, he destroys them. Yeah. But he's so bent upon himself and his own way of doing things that he still doesn't cripple the Philistines, and the Philistines' strength and authority over Israel itself.
That's
right.
It's
still there.
It's still there.
It's like he's having these temper tantrums that hurt pockets of Philistines, but he's not driving out the entire Philistine population to help Israel itself. He's helping himself.
He's exactly the whole time. When I learned about these gates, I thought of the phrase that the gates of hell cannot prevail against you. And I've always thought that phrase was interesting because I was like, the gates of hell won't prevail. Do gates attack me?
Yeah.
It's not what it's saying, right? It's saying the gates in those culture represented strength and authority, meaning the gates of hell can never have the authority and the strength over me when I'm leaning on Jesus. Wow. So that verse added so much to me when I learned about this week.
Yep.
Yeah.
That's amazing. That's cool. A great find. Love that correlation.
Thank you.
And now you can't accuse me of being the only one that plays it forward into Jesus' side. You've done it.
Yes, finally. I owned it.
There you go. I'll try to find a Genesis reference today. I think I might have it.
All right. Well, I'll hold you to it. I'll hold you to it. Was there anything else that you want to talk about the Samson story before we move on?
Yeah, we have once the razor hits Samson's head, that's the violation of his third kind of thing that he wasn't supposed to do as a Nazirite. Yeah. Right? They're supposed to stay away from strong drink. Yeah. They're supposed to not touch unclean things. Yeah. He's already done those two things. We covered that last week. Yeah. This time he loses his hair. Yeah, and then he loses his strength. That's
fascinating, right? Because this whole time we've been saying that his strength doesn't come from his hair. Yeah. His strength comes from the Holy Spirit. But yet when he loses his hair, all of a sudden God now leaves him. And so you're like, wait a second, was it the hair? So help me. We had this discussion earlier this week. Why now? Why does God choose to leave him now and not in the other times he lost his vows?
I mean, I think for me it came down to this was the final straw. This was the final and third violation of his oath as a Nazirite, which was one thing God had asked him to do and to be dedicated to him, was to be a Nazirite. And so when he loses his hair, that's the complete desertion of Samson from God, in my opinion. And it comes down to Samson's strength wasn't literally in his hair, but it symbolized his strength. It symbolized his connection to God. And when that's gone, God's like, at some point he says that he's going to turn his face away from sin. If you choose death and cursing, he's going to I'm going to turn my face away from you, Israel. And that's literally what God does. In 16, verse 20, it says, but he did not know that the Lord had left him. So God literally leaves him.
It's one of the saddest. That's one of the saddest verses. I've exactly the same.
Yeah.
It's when I read that I was like, oh, he doesn't even know.
Yeah. And his hair is also removal of his hair is also the final violation of his, or the final removal of his commitment to God. But it's the final symbolic removal of his oath to God.
Exactly. Right. Exactly what I was going to say. I think you're right on the money. Everything you said is right, but I think this one was significant because this is out of the three vows that are required of him. This is the only one that's an external oath. Yeah. Which oath was that thing that was a symbol, a sign.
Yeah. And that's the Hebrew word you showed us in Genesis or so around OTH, right?
Yes, OTH, oath. The very first time we saw it was when with Cain.
That's right.
God put an oath on him so people would know not to bother him. It's his mark. Then we have the rainbow. We have the circumcision. We've had
oath
over
being
and over
this outward manifestation of a spiritual reality or truth that God has made manifest.
Exactly. So I think this is why this one was the most significant, because it was the one thing left. What was already happening internally, this was the external, all right, you no longer can show that you're part of Yahweh.
Yeah. And by the way, I'll talk about this in probably some of the Pauline letters when we get there, but I think that forms the basis of the biblical sacramental worldview.
Yeah.
That's a big word for Baptists, but we'll get there.
I shook my head like I understood you. But on the inside, I was like,
whatever.
I love it. All right.
We also have with Samson, just to try to conclude real quick, we have the third time of the verb begin is being used with Samson in verse 19, when she begins to cut his hair. And then when it starts to grow back, it begins to grow back. And, of course, at that point, it's a very short-lived, Samson will be very short-lived because he makes his plea to God, and God gives him strength to kill the, 3,000 Philistines there at the end. So he finds his demise in his kind of suicidal rampage, but I would like to think he's being redeemed here in some sense.
Yeah, I was going to ask, why is the three important?
Yeah.
And you just answered it. You think it's this a kind of when you're reading it as a Jewish person, you would see that third time and go, oh, this is a moment of redemption, even though it doesn't last long. Interesting.
Yeah. But it's in the end, he gives his life for something bigger than himself.
Yeah.
God will use that and honor that.
I thought it was ironic that when he was imprisoned, he was forced to grind grain. And I was reminded the very first story where he interacted with the Philistines, he burns all the grain.
Oh,
and then now he's the one grinding the grain.
Almost bringing restitution to what he destroyed.
Exactly. And he used a donkey's jawbone, and he's doing a job of a donkey here. And so I thought those things were, I wrote the word ironic.
Totally missed those. That's a great find.
Ironic. So I thought that was really interesting.
And just let me conclude Samson by making a few observations. So, I can't remember. Do you follow MCU, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, the superheroes?
Did you ask me if I follow anything to do with Marvel?
I'll take that as a no. For those of us who do follow superheroes, especially in the Marvel Universe, there's this anti-hero called Deadpool. And anything that Captain America or Iron Man, all the good, wholesome heroes, Deadpool is the anti-hero version of that.
Okay.
And he still fights, in the end, he still fights for good, but he does it through very suspect and sometimes downright evil ways.
Huh.
And so he's not above killing people, for example, just because they're in his way. So it's really interesting, but that I made that correlation to Samson because I feel like Samson is the anti-hero of the superhero universe, of the Judges universe. And so some of these comparisons I have to other judges. Just let me read through these. Jephthah led his people and tried to remove Israel's oppressors from the land. Samson never leads Israel in battle.
Right.
So Jephthah, as much as we've torn down some of these other previous judges, they at least have some good aspects that they were following God's call. Gideon, let's talk about Gideon. Gideon turned to personal vengeance in the second dark half of his story, but Samson spends his entire career in the dark space. Right. And in the sequence of 6 judges, Samson parallels Deborah. We had a lot of good things to say about Deborah because I feel like she was probably one of the few judges that was totally faithful to God's call. Mm-hmm. But she is the third in the first sequence of judges, and Samson is the third in the second sequence of 6 judges. Deborah considers the conflict with Sisera. If you remember, that was the big general that they were fighting. Deborah considers the conflict with Sisera from the perspective of his mother, Sisera's mother, who was an enemy woman. But Samson is joining himself to enemy women at every turn in bad ways. And then Jael, who was the woman who killed Sisera, she attacked Sisera's head with a tent peg, and Delilah attacked Samson's head with a razor. And finally, in this last instance, we saw with Abimelech, the one who is under judgment is now within Israel. In some sense, Abimelech started Israel down a bad road. But it is Samson the judge who takes the role of the serpent now with Israel, and whose head is attacked by the woman, but fully leads Israel out of the garden of the promised land, at least metaphorically, and into their period of exile, at least spiritual exile from God that will start.
Well, that is an excellent summary of Samson compared to the other judges we've read thus far. That is really fascinating.
Yeah.
I love that.
Thank you.
You ready to move on?
Yeah, so we got 17 and 18 left in Judges this week. And so in 17, we start with Micah and this Levite. What's going on here?
Yeah.
And is this the Micah the prophet?
Oh, I don't think so. No, not the same Micah.
Okay. It took me 15 minutes to realize that.
I love that you made double sure. Mm-hmm. Like you couldn't move on until you made sure.
Yeah. And Micah, we'll get to him because he has his own book, his own prophetic book. But he was a minor prophet in the history of Israel that comes later in the reign of the kings. Much later.
Much later.
Like at least 100 or 200 years later.
So why is this story here in the midst of the judges? And I think it's a couple things. We're going to see stories of some Levites. Mm-hmm. The Levites are supposed to be the priestly leaders. We're seeing all these judges who are leaders. Yeah. And now we see the people who are supposed to be set apart doing priestly things. We're going to see that they're falling too. Yeah. And then we're supposed to see kind of this average, everyday family group. And we're supposed to see the people as a crowd, which is the tribe of Dan. And so we see like a large group of people, we see like a small home, and then we see the Levites. And I think the reason why this is here now is because we're supposed to imagine when the leaders are so corrupt and so not following the Lord, it doesn't take long for the people to follow suit.
Right.
And I think we're supposed to see here, like when the leadership is bad, the people too. Now, does that mean that every person and every family group is no one's following God? No, I don't think that's true. That's why we get the book of Ruth.
Right.
That's coming.
Right.
Insert Ruth, right?
I was just thinking that.
Yeah, but this is supposed to show, but mostly when the leadership is corrupt, the people are going to be corrupt as well, and we're going to see that story start here. I think that's why
I love that it does this because it shows every aspect of Israelite society at this point in history.
Yeah.
And you're exactly spot on. It not one aspect of their society is blameless or innocent in any of this.
Right. So yeah, we have this man, Micah, and it starts off with him. Apparently, he stole a very large amount of money. Yeah. It's the same amount we saw in the Delilah story.
Because the Philistines gave Delilah 1,100 pieces to betray Samson.
Right, and when that was brought up, it's supposed to imagine this is a lot of money. Like this is like retirement. It's like winning the lottery amount of money. And the reason why it's repeated, not because it's the same money, but it's supposed to represent this is a lot of money. So he's stealing. He's not just picking pocket out of his mom's wallet. Like that was a lot of money is the point.
Yeah, and I don't know. It's not in the text. The text doesn't say this, and it probably alludes against what I'm about to say, but I like to think it's the same pieces of silver, so I don't know. It just kind of ties it back to what was happening before, and like this 1,100 pieces of silver is just continuing to work its woe and
I think maybe in a symbolic way.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's like literally the same,
yeah,
but I think symbolically it's
right.
the same. It's the same. The money, this, like you said, kind of started this. That Israel's going downhill as
downward spiral.
Yeah, as money and wealth becomes more important than Yahweh.
Yeah, that's a great point.
So I think you're right on. So when you first meet Micah, you're supposed to be like, oh wait, is he must have had a change of heart or something. Like he's giving the money back, he's apologizing, but then you're like, wait a second, why is he giving the money back? Is it because he had a change of heart, or why? Did you catch it?
I thought he didn't want to get in trouble.
It's not that he didn't want to get in trouble. He didn't want to be cursed. His mom put a curse, and he overheard this curse. She put a curse on whoever stole the money, and he heard the curse, and he was like, he really believes it could affect his life. Yeah. So he gives the money back. He's like, I don't really want this money. Forgive me. And then she turns around and blesses him in Yahweh's name. I'm going to give this money to Yahweh, but to bless my son. So that you have a person who's using Yahweh's name in the proper way, but she, on her own mouth, is the one who's cursing and trying to bless people out of both sides of her mouth. This is not a person who follows Yahweh.
So they're kind of starting to treat God like our culture, honestly, has treated God for a few decades now at least. It's like God is the great helper in the sky, right? I'll call upon God when I just need help for myself. Like, God, help me out of this situation, or I need help because times are tough, but we're not really relying on God. We're just using him as a bank teller to kind of get out of jail free.
You're exactly right. You're going to see this again because later in the story, the Levite shows up to Micah's house. And at first, you're supposed to think, oh no, because if you know what a Levite's supposed to do, they're supposed to be the ones when they find someone who has idols, they're supposed to destroy them. That's what the Levites are supposed to do. When they find people who are worshiping idols, they're supposed to literally, utterly destroy them.
And the fact that this Levite's wandering the countryside like he doesn't know where he's assigned to
Right,
to
he doesn't have a purpose. He clearly doesn't feel like he has a purpose.
Which, to your point, just kind of shows the spiritual waywardness of Israel.
You're absolutely right. Yeah. And then this Levite comes, you're supposed to think, oh no, that Micah's going to be dead. And then instead the opposite happens. Micah coerces him with money. Yeah. And says, I'll pay you to be my priest. And he says yes, and he says, now Yahweh's going to bless me. He literally sees Yahweh, this Levite, being part of his family now and paying him to be part of his temple leader and doing sacrifices in his own personal homemade temple. He believes that now Yahweh's going to bless him, like he's like some sort of lucky charm. That's exactly why he feels.
Yeah, it's like he feels like if he does the right form, the right process and ritual, that he can control God. God's not being controlled by ritual or even sacrifice. Even the sacrificial system that is set up in Leviticus, he's not being controlled by that. Right. That's not, you don't put the quarter into the machine and have God pop up and perform for you. It doesn't work that way. It's exactly backwards how it really works. Micah's name in Hebrew is Mikayehu, Mikayehu, which means who is like Yahweh. It's ironic that he who is like Yahweh sets up an idol factory, a household of idols, the text says, in his house.
Not only that, but he makes it his own ephod. We talked about how bad that was with the Gideon story. You almost get this feel where you're like, remember how we said Gideon was kind of, I call it the aftermath of Gideon? It's almost like he doesn't think it's even any big deal. Gideon did it, so
for him,
why
it's
can't I
not
do
even
it?
Aftermath. This is the primary aspect of his life.
Right. I guess what I meant is that the aftermath of Gideon is something I've been saying since the Gideon story, that we see all these people repeating Gideon's behavior.
The aftermath of Gideon became the primary pattern that Israel acts out.
Exactly. Yeah. That's exactly my point. And here you have a person who thinks it's no big deal to have an ephod in their temple and worship it. That's huge.
And nowhere does God respond to any of this.
Exactly right. Yeah, he's nowhere to be found here, that's for sure.
So then we go to chapter 18, and the tribe of Dan makes an appearance.
He does.
And just to level set us, so one, I'm going to put a map. I want to post a map here. It'll show kind of some cities to orient us. You'll see the hill country kind of in the center of the map. That's where the land of Ephraim was. I think they're destroyed by now because we covered that a week or two ago. But that hill country is where Micah's house is. So that just gives you a relative sense of where he's at. And then Dan is on this map. You'll see Bethlehem and Zorah. Dan is kind of in that region southeast a little bit from those regions. And in a minute we'll post a better delineation of the tribal land allotments. But we'll get to Laish. This is the land that this is a city that the Danites take over in chapter 18. Laish is outside the promised land. It's occupied by what the Bible says are these peaceful Sidonites, Sidonians, and then Dan rushes in and attacks them and takes the city Laish, which is way to the northwest of where they're at. And you'll see in the map, it's way up on the top. And they rename it Dan. They make the city after their own image.
Yeah, literally.
It's like not only are they outside the promised land, the promises of God, they're renaming that land, that Canaanite land, after themselves.
It's crazy.
Yeah, it's incredible
to see what they're doing. And at the beginning of the story, you see them say, hey, we don't have our inherited land. And you're like, wait a second. Yeah. I'm pretty sure they did have inherited land.
I had that question.
Yeah, and so I think what you're supposed to imagine is that they have...
Because in Joshua 19, 40 through 48, they get their land inheritance.
Yes. I think what you're supposed to imagine is this is their land to have. Yeah. They have every right to attack it. They have every right to go take their land. Yeah. It's theirs.
And they're not doing it.
And they're not doing it. So they're either... And that means they don't have the faith in God. Mm-hmm. Because we know... with God, with Yahweh, they can have that land. Yeah. He's done it over and over and over again. And so now they're looking for new land. And
so not only have they not taken their land, we'll post another map here that talks about the 12 tribes of Israel and their allotment. But Dan is kind of south of Ephraim and north of Judah. So they're kind of protected between powerful tribes if everybody's doing their job. But there are going to be witnesses to the Philistines, because it's not on this map, but the Philistines are along the southeastern coast of the Mediterranean there, where they settled. But Dan was supposed to be the witness to the Philistines. Yeah. And that's where Samson comes from. He's from the tribe of Dan. But they don't. They don't like their land allocation, so they're rushing up into the northwest, running away from their call from God. Yeah. And end up kind of exposed on the northwest side of Israel's territory, and that literally becomes the crossroads that all the empires later will come into Israel and conquer the land. So
they put themselves there.
They messed themselves up by not following God's call, by trying to, in Lot's fashion, Lot versus Abraham. Lot goes and picks his own land. Yeah. Dan goes and picks his own land, and then they get overrun by empires in future years and centuries. But by the time Revelation comes, they're not even listed in Revelation when the tribes of Israel are listed. They're so wiped out, they're not even in the memory anymore.
Yeah, I wrote the same note down about them not being in Revelation 7. And on the way, they stop by Micah's house, which is fascinating.
That's kind of where we were. Yeah. I was trying to get to by setting us up.
Yeah, so they stop by Micah's house, and the first thing they do is they ask, the first time they go by, they have spin out some spies.
Yeah. The spies like they sent into the promised land Moses did.
Exactly the same kind of stuff. They even come back and say, the land looks very good. I'm like, that sounds so familiar. Yep. They go by, and they see this Levite, and they recognize him. They recognize his scent, it says, which I thought was interesting. It means he's probably doing sacrifices and stuff. No, I'm sure he's doing his priestly duties.
That's a good point.
Right? But he's doing it in this person's house. The temple is not, Levites are only allowed to do the work in the temple.
Oh man, Micah's house is becoming a new temple.
I think that's the point. Yeah. They smelt the scent.
Wow.
Yeah, I think that he's acting like a full-blown high priest in his own temple outside of the tabernacle, which is insane to think about. They come by and they're like, "Hey, you're a Levite. Why don't you go find do an oracle for us and tell us if God's going to be with us or not?" And he does. He just unknowingly, clearly not using the Holy Spirit, because if it was what a Levite's supposed to do is he's supposed to go back and he's supposed to use the Thummim.
The Uman and the Thummim,
yes,
which we talked about.
Yes, we're supposed to use those to ask for that, and then they're supposed to cast a lot, and based on the lots would tell them what they should do. He doesn't do that at all. He just willy-nilly says, "Yep, go ahead, have confidence, God is with you." And they take that as an opportunity. When they come back and say, "We spied out this land, it's perfect, it's great for us," they're so unexpecting. They're not even guarded. Yeah. But the Lord will be with us because the Levite said so. Yeah. He literally willy-nilly just with confidence says, "Yep, Yahweh with you," and has no idea what their plan is.
Dang.
I think that is so sad how far they have come.
That's crazy.
They go by Micah's house, and they go by it the second time. The second time, what do? They steal all of the idols.
Yeah.
And they convince this Levite to go with them. And they're like, we'll pay you. We'll pay you more than he's paying. Would it be better for you to be a high priest over an entire tribe and not just one house?
Yeah, we're a tribe of Israel.
We're a whole tribe. Wouldn't that be? Yeah. Look at you. You're up. It's an upgrade.
Yeah.
So they steal all of his idols, all of his money, and they steal his priest, which was described as he said he's like a son to him.
Yeah.
And they steal him too. And then this is the thing I think I caught that got me the most. And then you see them steal all this stuff and steal their priest. And they're marching up to the land that you're pointed out in the map. And they pass the very place where the tabernacle is with idols in hand.
Wow.
If you look at the map, they have to go right by Shiloh to get to where they were going.
Yeah.
Marching to destroy people who they have no right to destroy.
Yep.
Holding idols in hand with a priest acting like a high priest outside of the tabernacle, and they just march right on by.
Wow.
That is just so sad. There's so much sadness in this story.
They've taken all of the ceremonies, signs, and rituals of Israel's life with Yahweh and co-opted it for themselves and set themselves up as their own God.
Yeah.
Just like what happened in the Garden of Eden.
And they will be destroyed because of it.
That's what happened in the Garden of Eden, and that's what led to Adam and Eve's exile.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah. Exactly right. Yeah. And they will be completely destroyed as a people group because of it.
Yep.
There you go.
It's amazing.
Well,
and by the way, some of my insights have come from Marty Solomon, so I'm going to post a link to one of his posts, and I'm using a couple of his maps, so I want to give credit to Marty on the BEMA Podcast as well.
Awesome. Shall we move on to John? Ready for that?
Yeah, I just had one more question.
Do you have one more thing in the section before we move on?
So in verse 30 of chapter 18, and the people of Dan set up the carved image for themselves, and Jonathan, the son of Gershom, son of Moses, and his sons were priests to the tribe of the Danites until the day of captivity of the land. And so we finally get the Levite named. His name, he's Jonathan, but he's the son of Moses. What's going on with that? Is that the Moses the Moses of the Exodus?
Absolutely.
Wow. So his lineage has fallen so far that Moses, the man who walked with God and saw God face to face, they're reduced to this.
Exactly what we're supposed to imagine.
Wow.
How quickly they have fallen with this corrupt leadership. The judges that we've seen, that's how far. Exactly. And only that, but it also gives us what line of a Levite he was. He was not in the line of Aaron. In the line of Aaron are the ones who act as high priests. Yeah. The line of Moses, they have different ways that they're supposed to act. And so that also not only tells you that how far they've come because he's in the line of Moses. That is so sad. But two, is supposed to show he's not supposed to even act as the high priest. He's on the line of Aaron. He's supposed to be have different priestly duties. He's supposed to be in charge of things like the sacrifices and such like that. So.
Yeah, that's almost as sad as verse 16:20 where God leaves Samson.
Well,
so that's Judges for this week.
Judges. We are going to move on to
John,
the Gospel of John.
And by the way, Psalm 68 is so rich this week. I hate that we don't have time to talk about it because Psalm 68 is meant to be a processional song when they were marching and carrying the Ark of the Covenant into the tabernacle. It's something the Israelites would sing in celebration of God. So just spend some time in Psalm 68 this week because this really is a beautiful psalm. Awesome.
Absolutely. As we enter the Gospel according to John, maybe a quick little overview. John's Gospel, like you said, you love it. It's very different. It hits different. And I think the reason it hits different is because the first three Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels as we call them, are more focused on what Jesus taught and did. John is more focused on who Jesus is.
Yeah.
And I think that makes a big difference in the feel. The feel is very different. Beautifully, John actually ends his gospel with one of his very last verses of the gospel, kind of summarizes what I think his purpose is from the beginning. And so it's actually in John 20, verse 30 and 31. I asked you to read that.
Yes. Now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name.
There you go. I think that summarizes what we will see from the beginning to the end.
Yeah.
There you go.
So John in history is known as a pastor to Asia. Of course, he was one of the three main disciples of Jesus who became one of the three pillars of the church, is what Paul called them, Peter, James, and John, right? So church tradition has that John traveled among the seven churches that have the letters written to them in Revelation. And of course, this is the same John that wrote Revelation. So John is also, why is he writing this gospel? He's writing to a blended family, a blend of Jewish and Gentile converts into the faith. So we're going to see throughout the gospel that he uses the same language and the same stories to speak to both a Roman Greek audience as well as a Jewish audience. We'll see, for example, and we're not going to have time to cover the entire chapter of John 1 today, but we're going to focus on the first 18 verses as the prologue to John. So we're going to focus on that. But there we see his sense, or the sense that John wants to communicate that Jesus is a logos. And we'll get more into this in a minute, but that would have spoken to both the Roman Greek world and to the Jewish world.
Right. Yeah. It's good. Thank you.
And by the way, one more thing. A couple of scholars I found think that 1 John, the epistle of 1 John, is a cover letter for this gospel.
Really?
Yeah. Which I had never really considered before. I didn't look too much into it, but I thought that was a fascinating thought.
I may have to read it real fast this week.
See what you think.
And see if that fits. That's interesting.
Yeah.
I never heard that before. Very cool. Yeah, so like you said, John 1, verses 1 through 18, we consider like the prologue to the gospel. And I think this prologue, if you really spend some time reading it, it is personal.
Yeah.
It's poetic.
It really is.
It's powerful. It's really brilliant.
It is real. That was a word bouncing through my head.
Yeah.
Just the structures within the structures and the allusions to the Old Testament and to Roman culture and Greek culture in this is just masterful.
It really is. He really is speaking to both Gentiles and Romans, and he's speaking to the Jews and who know the history, and it's amazing. So let's dig in. Do you want to start?
But I think. Well, actually, I think you should start. Because I think you found some structures I'm really interested in hearing, and then I'll get into some of my stuff. But I wrote what you said down. You said that there's like a 1 through 4 is a line introduction, and then secondly, there's 2 sets of 3 paralleling parts, and there's a short, more dense conclusion.
Yes,
Tell us about
correct. That. Okay, exactly. So we start these 4 poetic lines, which is verses 1 and 2. Do you want to read those?
Yeah. In the beginning was the Word.
1.
And the Word was with God.
2.
And the Word was God.
3.
He was in the beginning with God.
4. There's our 4 poetic start.
And it's a very strong callback to Genesis 1.
Absolutely. In the beginning, immediately you think of, in the beginning.
That's my Genesis reference, by the way, I promised.
Nailed it. So that we have that from Genesis 1. And that is very true. But I also noticed, because back when we were doing the 10 strikes, the 10 plagues on Pharaoh, I did in Exodus, I did a deep dive on the structure of Genesis, and I was comparing it to some structures of that. And when I read that, I was like, wait a second, this structure seems really familiar to me. And so I went back and checked, and sure enough, not only is John referencing Genesis 1 by saying in the beginning, but the entire section of verses 1 through 18 actually matches perfectly to the narrative structure of Genesis, the creation story.
Wow.
Perfectly. Exactly the same. So you start out with the 4 poetic lines, which is exactly what happens in Genesis 1. And then you have 2 sets of 3 things that parallel. So in the Genesis story, you have 1, 2, and 3, and then you have 4, 5, and 6.
And
they parallel each other. Yeah. And then it ends with a dense conclusion statement. In the 7th day. Then you have the 7th day.
And by the way, the 7th day in the Genesis 1 story, is all about Sabbath. And so we didn't really cover Genesis 1 when we covered Genesis last year. But the whole point of Genesis 1 is it's a creation story, yes, but it's also a poem.
Yes.
And it's a chiasm.
It is.
And it's a little bit of a different chiasm than kind of the inverse parallelism that leads to a center. It's more of a direct parallelism between days 1, 2, and 3. They create the space, or God creates the spaces, and then 4, 5, and 6, where He fills those spaces in exactly the same order. But at the end, on the 7th day, is a foundation of rest.
Yeah.
And that really calls to humans to find their value as humans, their worth as humans, and their ability, 1, to be that they were created by God, but 2, that they can rest before they have to go out and work.
Yeah.
And so they're called to work, yes, but first they rest in who they are in God.
Yeah.
And so that's what the Sabbath is meant to call us to remember, and that's exactly what John is pointing Jesus to as is our Sabbath.
Right, and to add to that, so this is exactly right, but add to that, verse 18 is a really unique phrase in the Greek. In verse 18, the Greek leaves it purposely as a incomplete sentence. It says in the Greek, he has made known. He has made known. You're supposed to think, made what known? Right? In the Greek, it's supposed to be like, he has made known, ... But
Amber, my ESV says he has made him known.
Yeah, because English translators can't handle it. Yeah. They're like, they can't handle this incomplete sentence, so they have to plug it in. Now, do they plug it in with the right answer? Yes. It's the correct answer. It is the Son, it is the Father.
Right.
It is the correct answer. But it did not help what John was trying to do. He was literally saying, he, the Son, has made known ... And you're supposed to, everything here and now is going to tell me and answer that question for me. They already did it for you, which does no justice, right?
Did all the work for you.
Did work for you. But what is it pointing to? And we find out at the very, very end, Jesus is on the cross, and he says, it is finished. It is finished. That word finished is the exact same root word to the seventh day you just talked about at the end of the creation story. So if you don't mind to go to Genesis chapter 2 for me, because in English, once again, English translators, we have put ones and twos in places they don't belong.
We're so helpful.
We're so helpful. In Genesis chapter 2, it actually starts with the end of the creation story. So the creation story isn't over until after the seventh day, right? But for whatever reason, we make that mistake. Can you read verse 1 of chapter 2 for me?
Yeah. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them.
Were what? Were what?
Finished.
Finished. It's exactly the same word.
It's fascinating.
It's the same exact word. So where the matching stories of John's Gospel verses 1 through 18 matches Genesis creation story perfectly, it ends with a ... The end of the story you will find out soon enough.
Interesting.
And Jesus says exactly that at the end of the story. He says it is finished. Here it matches perfectly to the ending of the creation story. It is beautiful.
Yeah.
And powerful.
That's fascinating. It's almost like, I almost wonder if it's meant, in some ways, it fills in the lines of the original creation story in Genesis chapter 1 through chapter 2, verse 3. It's like, God finished, and there was a seventh day, and there was rest. Well, here's how Jesus embodies and fleshes that out.
I think you're exactly right.
That's fascinating.
Yeah. I love digging in this week. That was really amazing.
Yeah, so I had one more thing I wanted to point out, and along with all the allusions to Genesis that you've pointed out, there's also allusions to Exodus that John brings forward. Starting in verse 14, we read, "And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory as the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth." So a couple of things are fascinating about this verse. One, he became flesh and dwelt among us. That dwelt among us, that Greek word is purposefully meant to draw us back to the same words that was around the tabernacle and God being in the tabernacle, dwelling among his people in the tabernacle in Exodus.
Yeah.
And Numbers and Deuteronomy. So there's a sense that Jesus is a fulfillment, embodiment of God tabernacling with his people. Jesus is literally God tabernacling with his people. Secondly, in the same verse, "And we have seen his glory as the only Son from the Father." This is the same word as Shekinah glory, the Shekinah glory of God in the Exodus.
Yes.
And the Shekinah glory, the pillar of cloud and fire leading Israel through the Red Sea and through the wilderness years. So Jesus is that aspect of God too. So we have Jesus right off the bat filling every aspect of Genesis and every aspect of Exodus that we've been tracking in our study.
It is really amazing. I've read John 1 through 18 before, but I've never really studied it in this way. And it has brought so much. I'm just imagining the people, Jewish people and the Romans and different Gentiles reading this and just all these things being lighting up for them.
Yeah.
And they're like, oh, it's pointing to something really specific. It's pointing to the Son and the Messiah. And it's just so brilliant.
And just to kind of wrap all this up, to your point, the Gentiles, Greeks, Romans would have picked something up. The Jewish audience would have picked something up, and all that can be illustrated in the use of the word logos. I promise to dive in a little bit more into that. And so logos was used by both Jews and Gentiles, but they had something totally different in mind when they read it. For the Jews, logos would have implied the word, obviously, but it would have implied what we think of as also as Christians as what God's word accomplishes. In Genesis 1, God spoke creation into existence. Yeah. God's word, in Isaiah and others, God's word goes out and creates, and it doesn't come back to him empty. It does what it says. And a lot of the Jewish literature, Old Testament literature, will equate God's word with wisdom. They will personify wisdom in some way. And so, and then we move over to the Gentile side and how they would have received and thought of logos. For them, logos is an actual Greek word. And for them, logos was logic, order, and the principle that the Greek world was founded upon, all of Greek mythology. And so as we come into how they thought of the word is like reason. Logos was reason. It was how the world worked itself out based on logical order, kind of the natural outworking of created things. And just to give one, Plato, by the way, had a lot to say about logos, and I'm not going to get into a Platonic discourse here. That's way beyond Greek philosophy is way beyond the scope of our podcast. But the first Greek philosopher to use the word logos was Pythagoras, and he believed that the world was based on three main principles. One was monad, that represented the unification and reality of everything. The second was a dyad, which was a principle of diversification and differentiation. And then the third was harmony, and harmony represents the relation of one thing to another, represented by the proportion between numbers, geometrical shapes, or tones. And the harmony is based on logos for them.
Gotcha.
And so all that to say that their entire philosophical system was based on logos and the outworking of what the word or the reasoning of the universe meant. They wouldn't have thought of it as Jesus, but here John is claiming logos and applying it to Jesus to say, this is what you've been looking for. It's like the only thing to redeem something is to go into it and transform it from the inside out. That's what Jesus did with sin and death. He went into its heart and transformed it from the inside out. And that's what John is doing here. He's going to Greek philosophy and is going to transform it from the inside out. That's what happens to us today. If we want to transform the world, it's not going to happen through us beating people over the head with the Bible, right? It's not going to happen with us preaching at them. It's going to be with us meeting people where they are, walking with them, and helping them see God's view with God's eyes, so that they aren't doing what's right in their own eyes anymore. So we'll leave that with you this week, and we prayerfully hope that you're able to enjoy this week's reading as much as we did, that God speaks to you and you find something that you can use this week in your walk with Him as you're guided by the Holy Spirit to be Jesus to the world. And with that, we'll see you guys next week.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.